Right, everyone, this is the first video looking at market failure. Now, what we've spent the last few topics looking at is how the free market economy works. So how supply and demand work together using things like the rationing, signalling and incentive functions to establish market price and quantity. Now, in the real world, we don't let supply and demand determine every market because ultimately it fails, it creates problems. And that is because quite often supply and demand do not work efficiently to set the output of the market. So in other words, supply and demand can get things wrong. That's because supply and demand will not consider everything that we'd like to be considered in a market. So a market fails where supply and demand, when they work together, they create a level of economic welfare that is not maximised. Now what we're going to be looking at in this video is the market failure linked to externalities. Now these can either be positive or they can be negative. And they can either be in production or they can be in consumption. Okay, now all an externality is, it's where a market will create impacts for third parties. In other words, people operate outside of that market and either a producer or a consumer in that market, but they still are impacted by what that market does. Now, if we were to think about positive externalities, first of all, this is where the production or consumption of a good or a service will create good impacts on third parties. So, for example, when a firm produces something, it's creating good impacts for people outside of that market. So an example could be, imagine that in an area, they were to build an airport. Okay, well, local businesses that were there before the airport might benefit from the airport being there. So the increase in passenger numbers, people coming into the area, might mean more people eating local restaurants and cafes, stay in local hotels, visit local tourist attractions. Those businesses will see revenues increase, it might create more jobs, and it might help the whole area. Okay, but those people are not producing the airport, but they've benefited from the airport being there. Positive externalities in consumption. The best example is linked to education. Okay, when you gain education, you consume it, and ultimately you will get better exam results, you'll get a better job. That benefits for you, but you will also create benefits for people. So employers can get better skilled workers. It could mean that if you've got better skilled workers, that you can pass on your knowledge to other people and help them get better because of it. So you're creating benefits for people that haven't consumed your education. Negative externalities, these are just bad impacts on third parties. Okay, so negative externalities in production. Well, imagine you've got a business that operates lots of factories across the world. Well, those factories will create pollution, will create emissions. Well, those emissions will affect the air supply, which will create bad impacts on people across the world. Okay, whether you consume that good or not. Negative externalities in consumption, dead easy. Best example, smoking. If somebody smokes a cigarette, then it will create cost for them, but it will also create cost for other people. If you're in the area where then people smoke, you're breathing in their fumes, that's a cost for you, even though you're not smoking. It could even be the litter created from smoking as well. It doesn't look very nice, you're affected by what other people have done. Now, for the purpose of the exam, what you need to know are just two of these four different types of externalities. You need to know negative externalities in production, and you need to know positive externalities in consumption. Okay, now what we can use are a couple of formulas. So let's look at the negative externalities in production one first of all. When firms produce, what they will base their supply on is can they make profit? And what that will come down to, what will it cost us to build? What are our private costs to go ahead and produce our supply? So for a car factory, this could be buying the land, building the factory, maintaining the factory, the capital required to build the cars, the labour required, the cost of the materials, the commodities, for example, to make the cars. And as long as they can make profit on top of those private costs, then they will want to produce. The trouble is, a free market, the firms in a free market will very rarely think about these external costs. These are the spillover effects. These are the things that impact negatively on third parties. The pollution, for example, that's created, the waste, the noise. These are the external costs. Okay, now all social costs are SC is the sum of the private costs and the external costs. So because firms don't appreciate the full external costs, firms will overproduce, which leads to quantity being too high, which leads to lower economic welfare. So all negative externalities in production are, it's when social costs are greater than private costs. Now, when we look at positive externalities in consumption, when people consume goods and services, they think about what's my benefit? What do I stand to gain from consuming a good or a service? What are my private benefits? What people will not think about, that should be a plus there, by the way, are the positive impacts on third parties, those external benefits. And again, what these are the spillover effects. So when people study for a degree, they're thinking about how can they earn more money? What do they gain personally? What are their private benefits from doing so? They don't think about how their degree can benefit other people. So what you often have with positive externalities is that the social benefits are greater than the private benefits. And this often leads to people under consuming positive externalities, which leads to lower economic welfare. So the idea overall is with negative externalities in production, all those bad impacts, those external costs, will impact on people outside the market, lower their economic welfare, and they'll not receive adequate compensation for it. Positive externalities in consumption, because people undervalue how useful these things are, don't think about the greater good, if you like, those external benefits, they underconsume, which means society will miss out on loads of potential external benefits. Right, now in the exam, what you've got to be able to draw is a diagram to show these different things. Now what we start off with is something we call the optimal output point. This is where you would have no market failure. So we'd set demand equal to something we call MSB and supply equal to something we call MSC. And this will give us our market equilibrium point. We call this point as well the social optimal output. It's basically where we would like the market to be, where there's no market failure. Now, SB you should be familiar with. Social benefits are equal to private benefits plus external benefits. Social costs are equal to private costs plus the external cost. The letter M stands for marginal, and all marginal means is the addition to something. Okay, so if I was to consume one chocolate bar, I consume probably 300 calories. If I consumed a second chocolate bar, that will be an additional or a marginal 300 calories. Every lesson you go to, you add more knowledge to your head. You've got marginal gains from going to a lesson. Right, okay, now at the social optimal output point, the marginal social benefits are equal to the marginal social cost. That's where you want to be, and we'll see why now. Right, if I was to go beyond Q1, look at the problem. The marginal social cost could be all the way up there, but the marginal social benefits are down here. So here, we've got this over production consumption in the market. The marginal social costs greater than the marginal social benefits. In other words, it's creating more harm than good. The new costs or the additional costs being created are greater than those additional benefits. If I go to the left of the optimal output point, let's say here, we get a bit of a different problem at Q3. The marginal social benefits exceed the marginal social cost. That sounds a bit odd. It sounds like a good thing. Well, it kind of is. The new benefits being created exceed the new cost. But the truth is, if you were to stop at Q3, then you're missing out on that point where you've got more benefits still being created than costs. So if we were to stop here at Q3, we've got this under production consumption thing going on. So if we were to stop at Q3, we miss out on all that area there. Now we call that the welfare gain. What society would gain if we were to consume more of that particular product. What we've got over here is an area where the marginal social costs exceeds marginal social benefits. Well, that's what we call the welfare loss. That's the loss of economic welfare created by overproducing this good or service. So at the social optimal output point is where we maximise our economic welfare. Right, what we can now do is to think about the two examples that you need to know for the exam. Negative externalities in production and positive externalities in consumption. And all I do for both diagrams, I start off with the social optimal output point. So demand's equal to marginal social benefits and supplies equal to marginal social costs. And the idea will be that if we had people doing things properly, we wouldn't think about the benefits and costs for ourselves, the private ones, we'd think about the externalities being created as well. And the market would be at P1Q1. So P1Q1, that's our optimal output. It's where we want to be. It's where we're maximising economic welfare. The trouble is with negative externalities in production that when firms produce, they base supply just on the marginal private costs. They're ignoring the difference between the two. So you've got the private cost. If I add in the external costs, I would get the full social costs. Okay, now what this means then is that because firms don't think about the full social costs, it means their costs of production are lower than what they should be. They're not compensating people for their bad impacts. And that means that we go beyond the optimal output point. And look at the problem at Q2. The marginal social benefits are down here, but the marginal social costs are all the way up here. So we get this triangle, which is the welfare loss. So the market value here is that we overproduce, which means we get an area of welfare loss. People, in fact, lose economic welfare. Now, for positive externalities in consumption, when people demand, all they tend to think about is what's in it for them. They undervalue, they're not thinking about all those wonderful benefits for other people. So we end up stuck here. Okay, now look at the problem now. At this point here, those are the marginal private benefits, which means we miss out on these full social benefits. And we call that the welfare gain. This is what society would stand to gain if people were to consume this in the right quantities. So with negative externalities in production, we've got this overproduction because firms are not thinking about those external costs. And here we've got under consumption. People don't think about all those wonderful external benefits that could be created.